Commission will allow the parties to take the measure of each other's performance, to encourage attitudes to change, and to demonstrate that peace and coexistence is desired. Fourth, in advance of direct negotiations, the United States and no other party, inside or outside, can or will dictate an outcome. That is why the United States does not support annexation or permanent Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza, nor do we support the creation of an independent Palestinian state. I would add here that we do have an idea about the reasonable middle ground to which a settlement should be directed. That is, self-government for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza in a manner acceptable to Palestinians, Israel, and Jordan. Such a formula provides ample scope for Palestinians to achieve their full political rights. It also provides ample protection for Israel's security as well. Following these principles, we face a pragmatic issue, the issue of how do we get negotiations underway. Unfortunately, the gap between the parties on key issues such as Palestinian representation and the shape of a final settlement remains very, very wide. Violence has soured the atmosphere, and so a quick move to negotiations is quite unlikely. And in the absence of either a minimum of goodwill or any movement to close the gap, a high visibility American initiative, we think, has little basis on which to stand. If we were to stop here, the situation would, I think, be gloomy indeed. But we are not going to stop with the status quo. We are engaged, as I mentioned a moment ago. We will remain engaged, and we will work to help create an environment to launch and sustain negotiations. This will require tough but necessary decisions for peace by all of the parties. It will also require a commitment to a process of negotiations clearly tied to the search for a permanent settlement of the conflict. When Prime Minister Shamir visited Washington, he indicated that he shared our view that the status quo was unacceptable. He brought an idea for elections to, in his words, and I quote, launch a political negotiating process, close quote, which would involve transitional arrangements and final status. The Prime Minister made clear that all sides would be free to bring their preferred positions to the table and that the negotiated outcome must be acceptable to all. The United States welcomed these Israeli ideas and undertook to see whether it could help in creating an atmosphere which could sustain such a process. Just last week, the Israeli cabinet approved a more detailed version of the Prime Minister's proposal, indicating Israeli government positions on some, but not all, of the issues which are involved. The Israeli proposal is an important and very positive start down the road toward constructing workable negotiations. The Israeli government has offered an initiative, and it has given us something to work with. It has taken a stand on some important issues, and this deserves a constructive Palestinian and broader Arab response. Much work needs to be done to elicit Palestinian and Arab thinking on the key elements in the process, to flesh out some of the details of the Israeli proposals, and to bridge areas where viewpoints differ. Both sides, of course, are going to have to build political constituencies for peace. Each idea, proposal, or detail should be developed, if I may say so, as a deal maker, not as a deal breaker. It may be possible to reach agreement, for example, on the standards of a workable elections process. Such elections should be free and fair, of course, and they should be free of interference from any quarter. Through open access to media and outside observers, the integrity of the electoral process can be affirmed, and participation in the elections should be as open as possible. It is therefore high time for serious political dialogue between Israeli officials and Palestinians in the territories to bring about a common understanding on these and other issues. Peace and the peace process must be built from the ground up. Palestinians have it within their power to help define the shape of this initiative and to help define its essential elements. They shouldn't shy from a dialogue with Israel that can transform the current environment and determine the ground rules for getting to, for conducting, and indeed for moving beyond elections. We should not hide from ourselves the difficulties that face even these steps here at the very beginning. For many Israelis, it will not be easy to enter a negotiating process whose successful outcome will in all probability involve territorial withdrawal and the emergence of a new political reality. For Palestinians, such an outcome will mean an end to the illusion of control over all of Palestine, and it will mean full recognition of Israel as a neighbor and partner in trade and in human contact. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not think there is a real constructive alternative to the process which I have outlined. Continuation of the status quo will lead to increasing violence and worsening prospects for peace. We think now is the time to move toward a serious negotiating process to create the atmosphere for a renewed peace process. Let the Arab world take concrete steps towards accommodation with Israel, not in place of the peace process, but as a catalyst for it. And so we would say, end the economic boycott, stop the challenges to Israel's standing in international organizations, repudiate the odious line that Zionism is racism. For Israel, now is the time to lay aside once and for all the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel. Israeli interests in the West Bank and Gaza, security and otherwise, can be accommodated in a settlement based on Resolution 242. Forswear annexation. Stop settlement activity. Allow schools to reopen. Reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights. For Palestinians, now is the time to speak with one voice for peace. Renounce the policy of phases in all languages, not just those addressed to the West. Practice constructive diplomacy, not attempts to distort international organizations such as the World Health Organization. Amend the covenant. Translate the dialogue of violence in the Intifada into a dialogue of politics and diplomacy. Violence will not work. Reach out to Israelis and convince them of your peaceful intentions. You have the most to gain from doing so, and no one else can or will do it for you. Finally, understand that no one is going to deliver Israel for you. For outside parties, in particular the Soviet Union, now is the time to make new thinking a reality as it applies to the Middle East. I must say that Chairman Gorbachev and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze told me in Moscow 10 days ago that Soviet policy is changing. New laws regarding immigration will soon be discussed by the Supreme Soviet. Jewish life in the Soviet Union is also looking better, with students beginning to study their heritage freely. Finally, Finally, the Soviet Union agreed with us last week that Prime Minister Shamir's election proposal was worthy of consideration. These, of course, are all positive signs, but the Soviets must go further to demonstrate convincingly that they are serious about new thinking in the Arab-Israel conflict. Let Moscow restore diplomatic ties with Israel, for example. The Soviets should also help promote a serious peace process, not just empty slogans. And it's time for the Soviet Union, we think, to behave responsibly when it comes to arms and stop the supply of sophisticated weapons to countries like Libya. Ladies and gentlemen, I said at the beginning of these remarks that the Middle East had approached a turning point. I believe that this region, which is so full of potential, will not remain immune from the changes which are sweeping the rest of the world. These changes begin with the quest for democracy, for individual freedom, and for choice. Long ago, of course, Israel chose this path, and long ago, the American people decided to walk with Israel in her quest for peace and in her quest for security. The policy I have described today reaffirms and renews that course. For our part, the United States will move ahead steadily and carefully in a step-by-step approach designed to help the parties make the necessary decisions for peace. Perhaps Judge Learned Hand expressed it best when he said, "We shall have to be content with short steps, but we shall have gone forward if we bring to our task patience, understanding, sympathy, forbearance, generosity, fortitude, and above all, an inflexible determination." Thank you all very, very much.
C-SPAN 2 and its companion network, C-SPAN, are the cable industry's channels for public affairs programming. Since June of 1986, C-SPAN 2 has provided nationwide audiences with live coverage of the United States Senate and an inside look at the democratic process. If you have a question or comment about our networks, please write us at the C-SPAN Networks, 444 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite number 412, Washington, D.C., 20001.
Good morning. I'm Mayor Mitchell, and I'll... Good morning. I'm Mayor Mitchell, and I would like to welcome you to AIPAC's session on the importance of grassroots involvement in strengthening of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The uniqueness of this morning's session, given AIPAC's historic focus on foreign policy, is its emphasis on grassroots politics at the state and local level. U.S. foreign policy is ultimately decided in Washington, D.C. Yet in the last year, we have watched as the Middle East has become a hot issue at the state and local level, at town meetings, at state political conventions, and even in city election ballots. All politics is local, is particularly relevant to the pro-Israel community. Despite the correctness of our message, even the best friends of Israel on Capitol Hill will not be with us for long if his voters, party activists, and local elected officials back home do not favor strong U.S.-Israel relations. The meetings that you will have with your congressmen and senators tomorrow, and your work with them over the next year, are critical to the U.S.-Israel relations. But they alone are not enough. More and more support by our friends on Capitol Hill will depend on the support for Israel that you build in your own backyards. AIPAC is committed to expanding our grassroots program to deal with the Middle East debates facing us in our neighborhood forums and in our state houses. We're honored to have leaders of both political parties with us to provide their perspective on how our involvement back home can help strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship. Our two panelists are Lee Atwater and Governor Bill Clinton from Arkansas, I have the privilege and pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Lee Atwater. Lee was unanimously elected the chairman of the Republican National Committee in January of this year after serving as the manager of the Bush Quayle '88 presidential campaign. As the newly elected chairman of the RNC, Lee immediately faced an issue in Louisiana, where David Duke, the Republican candidate and former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and self-proclaimed neo-Nazi, was running for the state legislature in Louisiana. He simply said, "We will try to do anything we can to defeat this man." And I was personally involved in that effort to try to beat David Duke, and I can tell you that the Republican National Committee and Lee Atwater did everything that we could do to try to make that happen. But we didn't succeed. Duke did manage to get elected, but immediately he was categorically rejected by the National Republican Party and its leadership. A native of South Carolina, Lee began his political career as an aide to U.S. Senator Strom Thurmond and as an activist in campus politics, culminating in his election as National Director for College Republicans. In 1974, he formed his own political consulting firm, and in 1978, he served as political director for Senator Thurmond's successful re-election campaign. He went on to manage Ronald Reagan's victorious 1980 South Carolina primary campaign and was promoted to regional political director of the Reagan-Bush campaign. Subsequently, he served as deputy director in the Reagan-Bush '84 re-election campaign. Lee Atwater has been a friend of AIPAC and a strong advocate of U.S.-Israel relationships. He was a very accessible person during the 1988 presidential campaign. He met with senior staff of AIPAC, and as campaign manager of the Bush presidential campaign, he helped ensure that strong pro-Israel language would be clearly stated in the national Republican platform. Lee, we appreciate your joining us today to share with us your views on how pro-Israel political activists can get involved in the Republican Party and help strengthen the pro-Israel agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, Lee Atwater.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mayor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you a lot. Thank you. Great. I like it. You get a standing invitation before you speak. That way, if you do bad, it doesn't matter. But I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. And I want to tell you how much my friendship over the last few years has meant with Tom Dine. And Tom, I appreciate you having me here today. He does a remarkable job for you all. And I am also glad to be here with my fellow Southerner, Governor Clinton. And Ed Levy, who I've known for quite a while, and Mayor Mitchell, another fellow Southerner from Mobile, Alabama. And of course, Liz Schreier, who has done a remarkable job and is a fellow Paul. She's a political director, as you know, and I've enjoyed working with her as a political person myself. I also want to acknowledge a few of the allies I have had out in the political trenches, who I think are here. Some are, some aren't. Gordy Zacks, George Klein, Jack Stein, the grand old man of our party, Max Fisher, Howard Core, and Marshall Breger. And I see a lot of other friends here today. And those of you who know me know that, frankly, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm a partisan politician. And my goal as chairman of my party is to make the Republican Party the majority party in the United States by the year 2000. A big part of that job is to broaden the base of this party. And Jewish voters, frankly, will be key to this effort. And I frankly believe that Jewish voters have a lot more in common with our party than voting percentages recently would indicate. Because like you, we believe in a strong defense. We believe in standing by our allies. We believe in the need for educational reform, family values, and toughness on crime. But to achieve these goals, we're going to need the help of Jewish voters in reinvigorating the grassroots of our party. Some of you here are already involved in grassroots politics in our party, and I urge you to share these experiences you've had with us to your fellow members. And for those of you who lean toward the Democratic Party, and those of you who are not involved at all in politics, I'm here to tell you about what we stand for, and to urge you to come on, get on board with us. What do we have to offer Americans who are concerned with U.S.-Israel relations? I'm proud to stand here today and unequivocally say, and unabashedly say, there's been no better time for U.S.-Israel relations than over the past 8 years of Republican leadership. Ronald Reagan and George Bush based America's relationship with Israel on strong things and on solid things. They based our relationship with Israel on common heritages of civilization. They based our relations with Israel on our moral commitment to preserving the Jewish nation. And they based our relationship with Israel on our mutual strategic interests. Nearly 60% of the U.S. aid sent to Israel since its establishment was sent by President Reagan and Bush. It was Ronald Reagan and George Bush who refused to back down on the issue of Soviet Jewry in their discussions with Gorbachev. And that, my friends, is why thousands of Soviet Jews are leaving today. And now that my friend and my mentor George Bush is president, our relations with Israel, based on those strong bonds, is only going to go stronger. Now, frankly, I don't know and don't pretend to know a lot about the finer points of foreign policy, but I know an awful lot about the character of George Bush. I've been with him now almost 20 years. And I can tell you, there's not a finer man to hold the office of President of the United States. There's not a more honorable man. There's not a man that understands the nation. There's not a man that understands the notion of commitment better than George Bush. And I know, flat out, that he's committed to Israel and to Jews all over the world. Now, you may not have known, some of you do, I know, some of you may not. When thousands of Ethiopian Jews were stranded between warring factions in that famine-plagued nation, their lives were cheapened in a land where nearly 1 million human beings had already died of starvation. Their plight was considered hopeless. Working diligently, secretly, and behind the scenes, George Bush personally saw to it that the full weight of the United States government was thrust behind an operation to airlift Ethiopian Jews to Israel. And as typical, he stayed behind the scenes and didn't get credit. And frankly, if he were here today, he wouldn't be telling you this. But I don't mind telling you at all. He's been my mentor, and I'm very proud of him. And you're going to be very proud of him, too. Now, our commitment to Israel is clear and unequivocal. And I'm very excited in this new job because I'm learning more and more about Israel. Upon my election as national chairman, I feel now a special obligation to learn more about Israel, a country that plays such an important role in our politics and in the politics of the world. As a matter of fact, I want you all to know that the very first international trip I'm taking as chairman of the Republican Party will be to Israel this summer. Thank you. I want to see firsthand a country that has such close bonds and so much in common with the United States. As a strategist, I want to learn more fully the threats to Israel's survival. And I really don't think there's a substitute for seeing the geography and meeting the people of Israel firsthand to gain that understanding. I was honored just last month to have a private meeting with Prime Minister Shamir in New York, at which he extended to me a personal invitation to be his guest and the state's guest this summer in Israel. He's a fascinating guy. I can't tell you how impressed I was with him. He's tough, he's durable, he's no nonsense, my kind of guy in every sense of the word. At the same time, you get in a one-on-one situation with him, he's affable, good sense of humor, but you can see steel in his eyes when you look at him. And that's the kind of guy I like. Just the night before, I had gone to the state dinner at the White House in his honor and talked during the course of that dinner with the Secretary of State and President, and they both told me how fascinated they found him, how good, how productive the meetings were they had with him that day. And the next day, as I talked to Mr. Shamir, he told me the same thing. Because everybody involved understands the importance and significance of our commitment. Now, I told him, and I want to talk to you for a minute, we discussed our platform. Our platform, as you know, I hope most of you know, is 100% behind Israel. And I told him that we are standing forthrightly and unequivocally behind our platform, and I hope the Democrats will be as forthcoming next time around. I also met at length in my office with Ambassador Netanyahu, and I got to tell you, I was excited. Did I mispronounce that? Oh yeah, Yahoo Mountain Dew. Excuse me. That's what my staff told me to do to remember. But I got to tell you, thanks, I'll try to mess up something else. But I got to tell you, I was very excited to see a man of my generation, virtually my age, in such an exciting position. And I'm going to tell you one thing. Here's an Atwater prediction. This guy's going to be around for a long, long time, and you're going to see big things out of him. Very, very impressive. He understands that in addition to being strategic allies, we're moral allies in a struggle between democracy and tyranny. And our party has been a steady voice in this regard, and by any fair standard has overseen the best period of U.S.-Israel relationships in history. We're proven tough advocates for a strong commitment to future defense, safety, economic well-being. We've put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to continue putting our money where our mouth is. When we sat down to write our platform on Israel, it was done harmoniously and in very short order. That was I can honestly tell you, that was the one part of the platform that I, as campaign manager for George Bush, personally sat in on and personally supervised word by word. Now let me read part of it to you. The foundation of our policy in the Middle East has been and must remain the promotion of a stable and lasting peace, recognizing our moral and strategic relationship with Israel. As I mentioned before, that's a strong foundation on which to build a relationship. But there are threats to Israel's security that go beyond our bilateral relations. There has been and remains a specific threat to Israel's security, which is none other than the formation of a hostile Palestinian state on or within her borders. Now, what did our platform say about that? Let me read you. We oppose the creation of a Palestinian state. Its establishment is inimical to the security interest of Israel, Jordan, and the U.S., and we will not support the creation of any Palestinian entity that could place Israel's security in jeopardy, period. Now, what did the Democratic Party platform say about the establishment of a Palestinian state? A tremendous outburst of silence. Silent. Now, either the Democrats have difficulty in writing a declarative sentence, which I find hard to believe even for them, or they were not prepared to give similarly strong assurances to supporters of Israel in this country. Let us make no mistake, the Democrat platform's silence on the security interest of Israel is neither an isolated instance or an oversight. I remember the coverage of the convention well. There was talk of some Democrats wanting strong language advocating the resolute protection of Israel. Those voices were hushed, partly because of a desire to take no strong positions at all, which is frankly one of the main reasons they lost the election, and partly because of a fear that any strong language in support of Israel might be seen as an affront by rival special interest groups in the party. The result was silence. Now, I must say, to me, being a staunch ally of Israel should not be a partisan position, so I truly will welcome a strong platform next time. But until recently, there's been no cause for partisanship. But we saw something emerging at the Democratic National Convention that has given us cause to point our party's stance on the security of Israel and juxtapose it with theirs. Because our support is absolutely unequivocal and is in black and white. I am proud of our position and record on U.S.-Israel relations. And as more voters become aware of the differences between the two parties, I am confident that more Jewish voters will see the Republican Party as their home. Because I'm not satisfied with the 35% of the vote we got, up from 31% in 1984, but not enough. I feel like we need more. Frankly, I feel like after voters examine the fact, they'll know we deserve more. We have shown our loyalty to Israel, and we've shown our resolve in keeping bigotry out of our party. I've taken a lot of heat for some of the things I've done recently. That's okay, that's politics. You've got to act on principle sometime, no matter what conventional wisdom, no matter what your advisors say. So frankly, when David Duke pulled his last-minute party switching act, I decided to do something that the party rules say I'm not supposed to do. I jumped into a primary situation. And I knew this guy was going to win. That's why I jumped in. Because, believe me, I've been in politics a long time, and I knew that in the South, when a guy like me jumps in, it doesn't help in the campaign. I've been running campaigns for 20 years down there. The best way to win is to have an outsider to point at. And I knew I would be that outsider, but to me the issue was national and it was of the utmost importance. I wanted to be on record before and after to show where we stand on bigotry and where we stand on racism. There's no room in our party, period, for the politics of hate, and I'll say that again and again and again. And I want you, thank you, I want you to compare for 1 minute our party's reaction, because there has never been a time in our party where we passed a unanimous resolution after this man's elected, saying that as far as we're concerned, he doesn't exist. He's excommunicated. Compare that to the Democratic Party's silence on Farrakhan. I remember as if it were yesterday the chill that went down my spine when I heard a very clear radio broadcast in which Louis Farrakhan referred to Judaism as a gutter religion. That is dangerous talk. There's no place for talk like that in American politics, and it needs to be denounced strongly and over again. Compare our solid support for Israel at all levels of our party politics with the Democratic Party politics, with its silence on the Palestinian state, with its timidity in dealing with Farrakhan, and the fact that Democratic conventions in 8 states passed resolutions in 1988 that have been perceived to be anti-Israel in their content. Additionally, anti-Israel resolutions were seriously debated in 12 or more Democratic state conventions. Fact. I understand this meeting today is about grassroots politics. I've got one thing to say about it. That's good. One of the most important things the Republican co-chair, Jeannie Austin, and I are attempting to do is build a grassroots base. That's how we strengthen our foundation, and that's how Friends of Israel can help us strengthen our cause. I encourage you, any of you, to get involved in Republican politics at the grassroots level. We'd be pleased, we'd be honored, we'd be humbled to have your support. I've said many times, power in this country resides in the hands of elected officials. So if pro-Israel candidates are truly to have a voice in our nation's governance, they must seek and attain office. So I urge you all to help us find candidates, and I urge a few of you to be candidates. I've already seen a few candidate types out there. I stand ready to help candidates at all levels of government who believe in our agenda and who are ready to undergo the grueling demands of a campaigner and office holder and who are ready to stand up and fight. Because our aim is to build a foundation for the Republican Party that would be strong enough to support us as a majority party by the year 2000. I am convinced, in closing, that a close look at our records, a close look at the facts, a close look at our accomplishments, and our stands on issues important to Jewish voters will convince you to join our party and to support our party. And I invite you all who have traditionally not voted for our candidates to give us a closer look. Just give us a closer look. Look at the facts and examine them over and over again. And I think you'll see, if you look with an open mind, that what we stand for is what you stand for. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Steve Grossman from Boston. and I have the privilege of introducing Governor Bill Clinton. Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas is one of the most eloquent and effective statesmen in America today. First elected at the age of 32, he is only the second person in the state's history to be elected to 4 terms as governor. He is currently chairman of the Democratic Governors Association and is a past chairman of the National Governors Association. Known as the education governor, Bill Clinton has devoted enormous energy to enhancing a wide variety of educational opportunities for Arkansas students. He has been consistently selected by his fellow governors and by the media as one of the best and most effective governors in the nation. Bill Clinton is and has always been a close and unwavering friend of the Arkansas Jewish community and of AIPAC. He was the keynote speaker at AIPAC's statewide political education workshop in Little Rock in 1984 and has traveled to Israel. Governor Clinton, as one who was on everybody's short list for the 1992 Democratic presidential nomination, we welcome you to our 30th annual AIPAC Policy Conference. We know that you are eager to articulate the principles and values that have earned the Democratic Party overwhelming support from Jewish voters and activists for so many years. We appreciate your taking time today to give us your perspective on how we can be most effective in helping to shape the national pro-Israel agenda by getting more involved in the grassroots political process. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Governor Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Steve. Tom, distinguished platform guest. This is the first time I've ever gotten to speak on the platform with Lee Atwater. He came to Arkansas the other day and said what the Democrats needed was a real Southerner like Sam Nunn or Chuck Robb, not a bogus phony like Bill Clinton. I'll tell you one thing. I read Mr. Netanyahu's book on terrorism, and now I understand Mr. Atwater a lot better. I think I'll talk about what you asked us here to discuss. One of us ought to. I am, first of all, profoundly grateful for this opportunity. I realize you could have asked any Democrat on the Senate or House Foreign Relations committees and any number of other people to replace Ron Brown. But before I go into my remarks, I want to tell you that he was invited. He could not come because he's at his daughter's college graduation, where I presume all of you would want him to be today, and he sends his regrets. I do want to point out for the record that since being elected chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Ron Brown has gone to exceptional efforts in more than his recent predecessors to reach out to the Jewish community in America. He has been to Israel 3 times. He recently issued a very strong statement of support for Israel to the Massachusetts Democratic Party when they were having one of these debates that was just discussed. And he will continue to be a strong advocate for the cause of Israel in the councils of the Democratic Party. I have been benefited more than most governors, and I want to talk more about that in a minute because that's what you did ask us to come and talk about, by friendships within this group. Sarah Ehrman's been my buddy since 1972 and has helped to educate me on these issues, and Bonnie Nickel and David Solomon and a number of other people in Arkansas have worked with me, and we did appear and do that political education seminar back in 1984, which I think was very effective for doing one of the things you wish to do, but not the other. The political education seminar that was done in my state, and like so many others, did an excellent job of building a group of people by congressional districts to make your concerns known to congressmen and senators. There's more to be done, and I want to say a few words about that.
First, let me say that the Democratic Party's commitment to Israel has been strong and deep. It has stood the test of time and debate. From Harry Truman to the Congressional Democrats of the 1980s. It is true, as Mr. Atwater said, that there have been debates at state conventions, but there was no vote at the National Convention because the people who wanted the anti-Israeli plank knew they could not pass it. They knew they could not get enough votes to be responsible. And frankly, a lot of the people who voted for those early resolutions didn't really know what they were doing. It didn't sign up to come to the convention because of any concern about the Middle East. And you and I have a better obligation than we have fulfilled so far to make sure that that does not happen again. I want to say that what I would like, first of all, to happen for you in the next few years. I hope that Israel will not be a political issue between the Republicans and Democrats, because I hope we will have a bipartisan, unbroken, unswerving commitment to the security of this country. I'm sometimes unpopular with my fellow Democrats, but I don't mind bragging on President Bush and didn't mind standing up for President Reagan when I thought they were right. And I agree that substantially Ronald Reagan did stand up for and support the security interests of Israel in the Middle East. And there's no point in denying that. But neither is it fair to say that the National Democratic Party, because of a very small minority who have a right to their say in our party and can debate anything they want, has changed its historic commitment. That is absurd. In the 1980s, if you want to talk about that, there were differences between Republicans and Democrats. President Reagan wanted to spend more on Star Wars, and the Democrats in Congress wanted to give more aid to Israel. Does that mean that Ronald Reagan somehow should be viewed as the enemy of Israel? No. There will be differences always, but if you look at the record, there is not one single shred of evidence to indicate that the vast majority of the Democratic Party has done anything other than stay right where it started, or that we're going anywhere, or wish to do anything other than to be a good friend of Israel. What our goal should be, what your goal should be, is to be free as members of AIPAC to say to Israel that the United States is our friend, is strongly committed to our security, will not use foreign aid to pressure us to do things that are against our security interests, understands that the Middle Eastern problems must be resolved by the parties who live there, and will not in any way undermine our security or their historic commitment to us to get to the end of the rainbow. That is what we should all want. That should be our common cause. Now, how do we do that? How do we do that? First of all, I would argue to you that notwithstanding the charges made by Mr. Atwater, the Democrats have known as well as any that the only thing that has preserved Israel to this point is its military strength and the support of the United States in maintaining that strength to maintain that security so that the democracy of the country can be maintained. The only thing that makes the difficulties in the West Bank today and Gaza so painful is that we share a common democratic heritage which keeps Israel from behaving as a military dictatorship would behave in the face of domestic dissent. And we know that. We know that. So I would say to you, let us try not to turn this forum today into another version of the political ads that so dominated the last presidential campaign, where we try to move somebody out of the mainstream and pretend that the Democratic Party itself has left Israel. You can't prove it by the Democrats in the Senate, by the Democrats in the Congress, and by the Democrats that get to vote on any of these resolutions once they know what's up and once you have a chance to be heard. So how do we get to where you want to go? I would say that AIPAC has done a magnificent job, better than maybe anybody else lobbying in this town, and working on Congress and the Senate. You have been stunningly effective, and you know it. And you've worked well in Washington, but you've worked well back home. What hasn't been done so well is the work on the governors and the state legislative leaders and others who wind up being in Congress, or more to the point of what the debate is today, others who may wind up being delegates to some county Democratic convention or state Democratic convention. That is where the attention needs to be focused. A lot of what has happened that you're so disturbed about happened in a vacuum, in a total vacuum. And whenever AIPAC members have moved to fill that vacuum, the results have been entirely satisfactory to you. When there is a debate, a real debate, you win. And so I would say to you just specifically, I recommend that you do the following things. Number one, take more people to Israel who aren't in Congress, who aren't governors, who aren't chairmen of national parties, but who might be someday. But who might be someday. I went in 1981. And before I went in 1981, I had a degree in international affairs and I thought I knew a lot about it. And the week I spent there had as profound an impact on me as any week I ever spent anywhere in my life. It makes a big difference. And when you go, when people go, make sure they get to see a lot of ordinary Israeli citizens. Don't just take them to government briefings. I sometimes wish every elected official could go first as a governor or a senator or a party chairman and then go back as an anonymous person who just happens to be there and take 2 trips. And I'm not sure the latter trip wouldn't build even more support for Israel than the former. But send more people there. Second thing, I think you should send the Near East report to more people. And it's a simple thing. Every state has a few major newspapers, and 1 governor and 2 party chairs, and a head of the state senate, and a head of the state legislative, and 4 or 5 people who have a lot of influence in state politics. And a lot of them would be flattered to receive it, would actually read every issue they got. And it would help to fill the vacuum. Third thing, I believe that there should be an effort to meet with important state legislative leaders on a systematic basis, just the way you meet with congressional leaders. Once or twice a year, it's no big deal. It's not a lot of trouble. It doesn't cost a lot of money. You wouldn't have to raise and spend near as much money on the state politicians as you do up here. We'd be grateful for a hot dog every now and then. And it would be terribly effective. And it should not be overlooked. And finally, and this gets down to the meat of the coconut that you were so disturbed about in these conventions. Look at what labor has done in the Democratic Party, and there must be some comparable effort in the Republican Party in working on recruiting candidates to these county Democratic conventions. Because they select the people that go to the state, or select the people that go to the national convention. A lot of people would be immensely flattered to go to these conventions just to be sought out by you, just to have the opportunity to be lobbied by you. I can tell you, not every state where Jesse Jackson got a lot of votes in the Democratic primary even thought about having a vote on an anti-Israel plank in the platform. We didn't. We didn't. Why is that? Because 99% of the people that voted for him didn't do it out of any concern at all with the Middle East one way or the other. And you know that as well as I do. That's too bad. That's too bad. If they then become vulnerable to vote against their own interests. But let me tell you, every single survey that's ever been done of the American black community shows that the support for Israel is very strong. People with influence in the black community are deeply and profoundly committed to the future of Israel and to its present security. And I think that what has happened that does make us vulnerable to the kind of excellent bars Mr. Atwater hurled at us today happened in a vacuum. And if you don't like it, you got to do something about it. And there's a lot of us that will help you. But shoot, I wish we were up here arguing about the Soviet Union. and our respective parties' policy or something else. I don't want us to ever have to worry about this again. And if you fill the vacuum, you won't. In both parties, at the grassroots level. Finally, let me just make one or two other suggestions. I think there are some things that have happened in Israel that can happen in America that will build an enormous amount of bonding between the two countries and reflect our common values and heritage and build you a lot more grassroots support. And I could just mention two. One is the work which has been done in some of the arid regions of our country to incorporate agricultural technology from Israel, specifically drip irrigation. Now, I don't think you should minimize for a moment the profound political consequences that can have. As farmers who might not ever think about the Middle East very much, come to know and understand a people and how they've dealt with common problems and build bonds. Even more important, second example. My state and about 8 or 9 others now have incorporated into our educational efforts the Israeli-developed home instruction program for preschool youngsters, the HIPPY program, developed over 20 years ago by Avima Lombard at the Hebrew University for Women, to try to help immigrants into Israel who come from poor, disadvantaged, undereducated societies to integrate into a highly sophisticated, highly educated society. It is profoundly important as a model for what we should be doing in America today, where the family unit has been under such distress, where so many of these kids show up for school not knowing their color, shapes, their numbers, in from out, up from down, and they go home and don't get any kind of structured support from usually from their mothers alone at home. A few years ago, my wife read about this program in another newspaper out of state, called Dr. Lombard. She came to Arkansas. We have now sent many, many hippie workers to train in Israel. And the Israelis have been to our state many times over this. There are 1,500 children in our state in this program. That's the largest program in the world outside Israel. Now, let me tell you, if you look at where these programs operate among people who are disproportionately poor, disproportionately dispossessed, disproportionately black. In inner cities, they have required a high level of visibility. They've been written up in Fortune and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report. They have built a bond in my state at the grassroots level that nobody's political rhetoric can break. Every 4 years in a presidential election. And all over America, there is this crying need to get little children off to a good start. It's not a Republican or a Democratic issue, but it could build a base, a bridge of deep, profound support between America and Israel that a lot of words can't build, and no future words could replace. So if all politics are local, those are my suggestions. And let me just say one thing in closing in defense of my party. I think the last 40 years will show that we have supported Israel for at least 2 reasons. First of all, obviously the strategic reason. We need an ally there. And Israel has been a wonderful one, and a bastion against dictatorship and communism. But we also share a common set of values and a democratic heritage. In the 1980s, early on, the rhetoric and the support of the Reagan administration, especially couched in terms of other decisions that were made with relation to arms sales to other countries in the region, showed that the focus of the support was on the strategic element. And that's fine. But if we can work out a more constructive, long-term, harmonious relationship with the Soviet Union, then the strategic considerations should abate. And what will be left is whether or not we are really committed to what Israel stands for and what it is and what it has always been. Not because the Russians are next door, but because we have got to preserve the state of Israel because it is the right thing to do. And I hope and pray that the reservations that the President has about the Soviets will prove unfounded. I hope that Mr. Fitzwater is wrong about Gorbachev being a drugstore cowboy. I hope that Vice President Quayle is wrong when he says he's a little bit phony. I hope that the President's reservation expressed at Boston University yesterday is unfounded, because if it is, and we can establish the kind of relationship we need to establish, then we can say to Mr. Arafat, give one speech, not three. Stay on one side of this issue. And instead of coming to us and playing politics here, go home and talk to those 21 Arab countries that still have not recognized the existence of Israel. Go home where the problem has to be solved. And then I hope President Bush can say to Mr. Gorbachev what he's trying to say all along. He's trying to say, and I respect this, put your money where your mouth is. But if we can reach an accommodation, he can say, you want to put your money where your mouth is? You want to really be loved more than me and everybody else in Europe? You want to earn that? Get on my side, and let's support a peace process in the Middle East that preserves democracy and Israel's integrity and the future of decent values in the most troubled region of our difficult world. Thank you very much.
Being a down-home Southern boy, I like the way those boys talk. I want to thank both Lee and Bill for excellent presentations. I think that the response of our 2,000-person audience indicates that they also appreciated the remarks. At the end of the panel, we're going to have hopefully a few minutes for question and answers, but we're under a very tight schedule today because of Secretary of State Baker's noontime speech to us. Now I would like to have the privilege and pleasure, and I am proud and pleased to introduce to you somebody you know who really needs no introduction, but somebody that deserves one, Elizabeth Schreyer. Elizabeth Schreyer is the political director at AIPAC, and I have the privilege of chairing the political committee and work with her closer than anybody at AIPAC. She is one of the young political talents in Washington. She came to AIPAC with both legislative and campaign experience. Liz was the legislative assistant for foreign affairs for Congressman John Porter of Illinois and staff director of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. She also worked for then Congressman Paul Simon and Illinois Governor Jim Thompson. She started at AIPAC in 1983, and after 1.5 years, she was promoted to the political director's job, taking charge of one of AIPAC's 5 senior departments. Since 1987, she has also served on AIPAC's senior staff. As political director, she is responsible for analyzing the 1990 races, including 435 congressional campaigns and 34 Senate campaigns, and the upcoming battle over redistricting. Liz and her staff meet with candidates for federal office, educating them on issues of concern to supporters of Israel. In addition, she is now also responsible for building a nationwide network of pro-Israel activists and re-energizing the pro-Israel community's involvement in state and local politics in an all-out effort to ensure a strong political base of support for U.S.-Israel relations throughout the United States of America. Elizabeth, we appreciate your introducing us today to AIPAC's important new program, the re-energization of grassroots activism. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Schreyer.
Thank you, Mayor and Steve Grossman, who really, too, are outstanding examples of pro-Israel activists. We've just heard from Lee Atwater and Bill Clinton two strong friends of the pro-Israel community, leaders from both parties who are welcoming our participation and offering to do their part to further the pro-Israel agenda. For our part, there is much to be done. Historically, so much of the debate on the Middle East has been confined to the halls of Congress. In that forum, as you all know, the U.S.-Israel relationship has thrived. The fact that the vast majority of Americans support a strong U.S.-Israel relationship has made a lasting impression in the minds of senators and representatives. It's been your involvement in the political process, your lobbying, and your educating our elected officials on the importance of Israel to our country that has helped strengthen this firm foundation of support for Israel. This strong foundation has been a constant frustration for Israel's detractors. In the past, the anti-Israel activists have focused their energies and their considerable resources on Capitol Hill, and all with very minimal effect. Yet over the past year, much has changed. The media's lurid and frequently skewed coverage of the Palestinian uprising has brought the Middle East conflict into our living room night after night. The anti-Israel forces have used this tragedy to their advantage. Concluding that their campaign was failing on Capitol Hill, they've begun to exploit the news coverage and to simultaneously to adopt a more sophisticated and different approach. They've sought to try to create an impression in the minds of elected officials that American opinion has shifted from strong support for Israel. The strength of the pro-Israel agenda has always been the strong American support for Israel. As our two-party spokesman, I think would certainly attest that nothing moves elected officials more than the will of their voters. As long as the will of the American public is to support Israel, U.S.-Israel policy will reflect this sentiment. Now, knowing this, and knowing that they couldn't make any real dent in support for Israel, our detractors have fabricated a mirage of erosion, an impression of a movement away from this historic support. After years of futility on the federal level, our adversaries have repackaged their message and refocused on a new forum: state, local, and party politics. Israel's foes have recognized what her friends have known since World War II, that in order to be effective, you have to play as an insider in the political process. The more sophisticated anti-Israel activists are exercising their right as American citizens to participate in the political arena, running for delegates at state conventions, running for precinct captains, sheriffs, and even mayors. In 1988, as already have been told, state Democratic platforms calling for independent Palestinian state was passed, and 4 American cities had qualified anti-Israel initiatives on their ballots. Now, I don't believe that sporadic anti-Israel initiatives and resolutions are dangerous in and of themselves. In fact, 3 of the 4 of these ballot initiatives were soundly defeated last year. Yet, each initiative, each resolution helps to broaden and may broaden this mirage of erosion. Clearly, as our 2 speakers' comments have just shown, we have not lost the support of the majority of the American public on this crucial issue. At the same time, we also must recommit ourselves to grassroots politics. After all, it is in the grassroots that issues are won or lost. You, as the leaders of the pro-Israel community, from 48 states here today, are needed now more than ever. Recent studies have shown that although the Jewish community votes in a much higher proportion than the general public, voting registration of American Jews has fallen. Approximately 25% of Jews who are eligible to vote are not using that right. And the most sobering statistic is that 4 out of 5 of those Jews unregistered to vote are under the age of 45. The number of Jewish delegates to the Democratic Convention dropped from 9% in 1984 to 6% in 1988. The number of Jewish delegates to the Republican Convention in 1988 was below 2%. Yet, we have seen, again and again, that when the pro-Israel community unites, when the merits of our issue are persuasively presented, there is no doubt that our cause will prevail. If you take the example, the recent example of what happened in California last year, when faced with anti-Israel resolutions on ballots in 2 cities at the state Democratic Convention, the pro-Israel community, under the leadership of almost every elected state official from the state of California, and in fact many of you in the audience today, shifted into gear. So many of you organized, you wrote letters, you met with delegates at the convention, you conducted phone banks, and in the end, you defeated every one of these anti-Israel resolutions. The example of California is a microcosm of both the need and the potential for effective pro-Israel grassroots activity throughout this country. Already in 1989, several states have begun to debate anti-Israel resolutions, and to date, every one of them has been rejected. This shows how our community strength has always been based on the merits of our cause and our passion for political involvement in the political arena. U.S.-Israel relations are far too important to allow a misrepresentation of American views to go uncontested. I believe, and I think all of you believe, that it's up to us, it's up to each one of you to get involved in grassroots politics. As our 2 speakers said, we need to get to know local elected officials better than we have in the past. We need to get involved in the political process, in the political party of your choice. And most of all, we need to let our voices be heard. In December 1987, our voices were heard when 250,000 people marched in this city on behalf of Soviet Jews. Despite the fact that so many Jews are being let out of the Soviet Union, there are still many of our brothers and sisters refused visas from the Soviet Union. Individuals that do not have the right to vote, that do not have the right to participate in the direction of their country. They can only dream of the freedoms that so many of us take for granted. We must never lose sight of the fact that we are very fortunate to live in a democracy. We have the privilege to participate in every aspect of the political process, and we must never forget that there is a responsibility that goes with such freedoms. I know that together we will meet the challenges in front of us to continue to work on our important work we've already accomplished on the federal level, but we also must expand and continue to work on the grassroots. I hope that next year when this conference meets, that we have a room full of 48 states and hopefully 50 states of people that are represented as precinct captains, delegates to the conventions, county chairs, in both parties in every single state. So I hope that we can continue to work with Lee Atwater and Bill Clinton and elected and local officials throughout this country in both parties to continue our work and blend the passion we have for our issue, the commitment we have to the political process, and together to continue to strengthen the very cause that we're all here today to do. Thank you.
I know you share my pride in having somebody like that working for us. We are fortunately going to have a few minutes for question and answers, but 2 very brief announcements. We want to encourage each of you to attend the grassroots workshop that follow this program, and we want to once again make a reminder about the 12:30 Secretary of State address. The doors will close precisely at 12:30 with no further admittance to the hall. So be here on time. Okay. Howard Core, okay. Howard Core is here, so we will take questions. Okay. Here is a question for Lee Atwater. What are your priorities as chairman of the RNC for 1990, And how can the pro-Israel political activists become involved in those efforts?
Well, frankly, from a purely political nuts and bolts standpoint, our number one priority is reapportionment, redistricting. I don't know if you all realize it, but our party has been receiving in the last 4 or 5 election cycles 48% of the vote in congressional elections, yet we only have 40% of the seats in the House of Representatives because we have been gerrymandered over and over again, and frankly, we've got to fight back. So reapportionment's our number one priority, which means we've got to win important governorships. California, frankly, is the most important one because that's 40% of the entire reapportionment process. We've got to win key state legislative seats. There are 10 states out there that a net change of 1 to 3 members of the legislature would give us control. Secondly is targeting. I am very big on targeting our resources. You only have 2 resources in our business, time and money. And I think of all the mistakes the Dukakis campaign made, the biggest geopolitical mistake they ran was running a 50-state campaign. You try to get everything, you end up with nothing. So we're going to target our resources very carefully. Third is candidate recruiting, and that's where you all can be very, very helpful. Not only are we trying to recruit quality candidates, I have one division set up that is doing nothing except recruiting women candidates. Because I am convinced the best way for us to end the gender gap for once and for all is for us to elect more women to office than the Democrats do. And then lastly, this answer could go on and on, but last important point is I want our party to be out front on issues. I think there are differences between these two parties. I, as probably one of the more non-kinder and gentler members of our operation, want to keep us out there and keep pointing out that there are differences between the two parties and to point out what the differences are. Thanks.
This is for Governor Clinton. In light of Jesse Jackson's political prominence and expanding power base, do you believe he will win the Democratic presidential nomination in 1992?
You gave Atwater a softball and me an onion. What deal is that? I think you would have to say that the odds are strongly against it, because I believe that the majority of the Democrats disagree with Jesse Jackson on a lot of the really important issues, just like they did this time, on all kinds of economic questions and all kinds of foreign policy questions. He gave voice to a lot of people in the black community and outside the black community who felt dispossessed and alienated and frustrated. And he spoke for a lot of them in very eloquent terms on other issues besides the one that you profoundly disagree with him on. But barring some substantial change in where he stands on the issues, I would say not. I think that he will not have as much leeway as he did this time in being able to say things that other Democrats disagree with for as long as he did without having people disagree with him publicly. And so, barring some unforeseen development, I think it is unlikely.
I can assure you, Governor, that the chairman of this particular session didn't use his prerogative as far as the selection of the questions. But I agree, one was soft and one was hard. But this is a nice, easy one. As one who is on everyone's short list for 1992, Governor Clinton, for the presidential election, what are your future plans?
I'm not sure I don't agree with Mr. Atwater. Maybe we'd be better off with none or Rob. I don't know. I'm just trying to be governor now. I tell you, I think what's important, though, one thing I do agree with Lee Atwater on is I think that my judgment is, anyway, that presidential elections are by and large won on issues, not on charisma. and not on strategy, although to be sure strategy makes a big difference. And I had more of a problem with the way we answered some of their attacks on the values of the Democratic candidate than the fact that they made them last time. I don't think you get anywhere in life blaming other people for your problems. But let me tell you what I want to do. I want to go home, do my job well, keep trying to do what I can to bring the Democratic Party back into a position where average middle-income Americans, the backbone of this country, can identify with it, find out, give President Bush a chance to do his job. It bothers me when people are running for governor all the time when I've still got a job to do, and I don't think that any of the Democrats need right now to be out there announcing or planning or working on running for president. He just got the job. Let him have a chance to do it. When he's right, we can support him, and when he's wrong, we can disagree with him in good faith. Thank you.
Well, here comes a hard ball to the left. To my left, to your right, okay? What do you think the Republican administration's perspective will be on selling sophisticated arms to countries not at peace with Israel?
Well, not being an official member of the foreign policy apparatus, I only want to say this. Our number one concern, and my number one concern as chairman of the Republican Party, is always the safety and the position of Israel. Our platform says it best. And let me just say this, and answer this question and everything else. I want to unequivocally say, as chairman of our party, I stand on, behind, beside, around, and all over our platform. So anytime there's any questions about where we stand, look at the platform.
My pitching arm has run out of steam. So as the clock said that this is the end of the ninth inning. I encourage you to go quickly to your grassroots sessions. I thank you for your attention, and I thank again the panelists.
That concludes C-SPAN 2's coverage of remarks by Representative Les Aspin at the 30th Annual Conference of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. For more information,
C-SPAN 2 programming information is available to our viewers 24 hours a day. For the latest schedule rundown, call 202-628-2205. That's current information about C-SPAN 2's live, gavel-to-gavel coverage of the United States Senate and other public affairs events that provide an inside look at government in action.
up next on C-SPAN 2, we bring you an address by President Bush to a group of...
We're about to hear our speaker, our luncheon speaker, will be introduced by Don Diamond. But before Don steps up to the podium, I'd like to recognize another distinguished person who's in the audience. Please welcome and recognize Governor Bob Miller of Nevada, who's with us.
Strategic cooperation between the United States and Israel is one of the foundations of that relationship. It has benefited both nations and made each more secure and better able to defend our shared democratic values. One of the most important people who have helped forge the strategic relationship is Congressman Les Aspin. In his position as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin facilitated passage of the fiscal year 1989 Defense Authorization Bill, which contained many items of importance to the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. As chairman, he worked to ensure funding for the Arrow anti-tactical ballistic missile program, for the procurement of the Israeli Popeye air-to-ground missile, funding for the procurement of the 120 millimeter mortar shells, and now for the Cobra laser night acquisition system. That's an Israeli-produced night targeting system that's used on the U.S. helicopters. Last year, Chairman Aspen also sponsored legislation making permanent Israel's status as a major non-NATO ally and stationing a U.S. procurement officer in Israel to facilitate the improved understanding between the United States government and the Israeli defense industries. His leadership led to the successful passage of this legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome one of the pro-Israel community's best friends in Congress, the Honorable Les Aspen of Wisconsin, the architect for the relationship.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't give you a standing ovation. I can't get a stage. We need 2 or 3 of those during the next half an hour. Thank you all very much, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you here today during the AIPAC luncheon. 30 years and 3 months ago, a then little-known senator told a gathering like this that, quote, "In the Middle East, we are moving perilously close to an arms race, which in the long run will be of benefit to no one." The senator was that's end quote. The senator who said this was John Kennedy. He is gone, but the Middle East arms race is still with us. Only today it is racier. Israel is no doubt, without any doubt, a power to be reckoned with in the Middle East today. Its army and its air force are well trained and well equipped. That is an incontestable fact. I would say that Israel is a dominant, if not the dominant power in the region. A power in the region that the region has rarely seen. But one thing that history teaches us is that military powers come and go. Military dominance is not for eternity. New developments can come to upset the balance. There's no question in my mind that Israel will retain its dominance in the immediate future. But as the future unfolds, we cannot be so assured that that dominance will hold. And that's what's important to us today. I believe it was David Ben-Gurion who said, Israel can win 100 wars and the Arabs will still be there, but all the Arabs need to do is win one war. Let me cite some potential challenges to Israel's security, all of which are visible on the horizon today. The first is missiles, the second, chemicals, and the third, nuclear weapons. First, missiles. Missiles are an example of the threats emerging from modern technology. As a result of their use in the war of the cities between Iran and Iraq, they have gained an added cachet. For many third world countries, missiles represent today what steel plants represented a generation ago. Proof of nationhood, a response to the self-doubt that so many third world nations suffer. The second emerging threat is chemical weaponry. Where missiles represent high-tech, chemicals represent low-tech. The chemical weapon has been called the poor man's atom bomb. Nerve gas is essentially nothing more than a very strong pesticide. Any country that can make pesticides can make nerve gas. The third threat is nuclear weaponry, the rich man's chemical weapon. This is still over the horizon, but it cannot be ignored. The day when at least one Arab country will have atomic weapons gets closer with each passing year. How to cope with these threats? How are we going to cope with them? There are, in fact, as anybody who follows the issue of military and military affairs will tell you that when you're faced with emerging threats like this, there are several finite ways to deal with them. One is denial. You can try and deny the opponent from getting the technology in order to do what he wants to do. Second is deterrence. He has it, but you have it, and you threaten to blow him up if he uses it. Third is preemption. You go in there and bomb his equipment before he gets a chance to use it. You just preempt. Take it away from him. Fourth is defenses. You can defend against what he has. Passive defenses with equipment or other things. You find out some way to defend against this new threat. The other two are political. The fifth is arms control. You can try and sign an agreement with your opponent and try and limit or eliminate the weapons that you're worried about. And the final sixth thing is peace. Let me go through each of these and see what they say and how they work. Denial is the policy we are pursuing today. The U.S. goal is to deny other countries the technology to prevent them from ever getting missiles, chemicals, or nuclear weaponry. 2 years ago, 6 NATO nations and Japan banded together in an undertaking called the Missile Technology Control Regime. The goal was to prevent the spread of missiles with a range exceeding 200 miles or a payload exceeding half a ton. It does this by barring the export of missiles, their components, or their blueprints to the third world. Now you can drive a truck through the holes of this agreement. The first hole is the absence of other significant countries from the agreement. This covers 6 NATO nations and Japan. What about the Soviet Union, for example? Now the Soviet Union has been thinking of joining the group and maybe observing the guidelines informally because it itself is not overwhelmed with joy at the prospect of more countries getting missiles. But there's also China. China is also, unfortunately, absent from this agreement. And China, on the other hand, may be encouraged by the missiles agreement to actually sell more missiles. China wants foreign exchange, and the Western missile ban has the effect of constricting the supply, which allows China to charge more to meet the unchanged demand. Argentina is working on the Condor missile, with Egypt and Iraq, no less. Brazil is investing in the Sonda 4. India in its Agni. Pakistan in its Harith. Next year, I expect we'll have more names and more weapon systems to add to the list. The other hole in this agreement is the difficulty of enforcing the export ban. Insatiable appetites in the third world will not be discouraged by a few laws. They will pay good money to get what they want. We saw how much armament Iran was able to buy during its war despite the ban on any sales of weaponry to Iran. In sum, the missile technology control regime has limited utility. It's not worthless, buys us time. It will delay the date when a whole host of nations will have accurate long-range missiles. I can report to you that the technology control effort has made it harder for the Argentine, Egyptian, Iraqi consortium to develop a working Condor missile. The program has slowed significantly because of this technology control regime, but it hasn't ended. We are following the same denial approach with chemicals and nuclear weaponry, with about the same degree of success. About 24 nations have agreed to bar the sale of chemical precursors for weaponry. The countries, however, cannot all agree on what chemicals to ban, and the ban leaks as exporters label the most vile chemicals as smelling salts or talcum powder or whatever to get them through the inspectors. In the nuclear realm, we have run a policy of denial for a quarter of a century that has seen India join the nuclear club and several other countries come pretty close to that goal. Of course, without our non-proliferation effort, several of these countries might already be in the club. So beyond denial, what else can we do? Well, the next possible response to the Arab countries getting missiles and chemicals and possibly nuclear weapons is deterrence. Deterrence is the underlying premise of our entire defense posture vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. We promised to make an attack by an opponent so costly that no opponent will dare attack. Deterrence is also at the heart of Israel's defense posture. Deterrence in the context of missiles, chemicals, and nuclear weaponry traditionally would mean to threaten retaliation with my missiles, chemicals, or nukes if you use your missiles, chemicals, or nukes. It has its limitations in the Middle East. Let's marry, for example, a chemical warhead to a Syrian missile. This is not speculative. It's already being done, albeit with a Scud, which is a fairly primitive missile. Will deterrence for Israel work here? Maybe, but only maybe. Israel depends on its mobilization centers for its unique military system to work. No mobilization, no Israeli army. Syria could put one Scud missile an hour down on each mobilization center armed with chemical weapons, just as it was launching an attack from the Golan. It's logical. Israel could not retaliate identically. The Syrians would be on the front line, not headed for mobilization centers. Israel could retaliate with chemicals on the front line, but Syria practices chemical defenses and may not see that threat to be greater than the advantage it would gain from hitting Israeli mobilization centers. In this scenario, deterrence is not something to bet the family farm on. How about preemption? The third option for Israel is preemption. That's what Israel did in 1981 when its fighter bombers flew beyond Baghdad to bomb the Iraqis' Osirik reactor. Preemption can work reasonably well when it comes to nuclear weapons and development. Nuclear work tends to be concentrated in a few big installations that are hard to hide. But what about chemicals? You don't need to build a gigantic single complex like Gaddafi is doing. That's poor planning, typical of Gaddafi. You can make sophisticated chemical weapons in a pesticide plant. You can make primitive chemical weapons in a garage. Before anyone knows you're making them, you can scatter them among the storage sites all over the country. In this case, you can't be sure that a preemptive attack will destroy your opponent's chemical warfare capability. Missiles fall between chemicals and nuclear weapons. The newest versions are commonly mobile, so it's hard to find them all. What's more, there's an exchange ratio problem. A plane is worth much more than a missile or two. To lose a plane is to take out a handful. To lose a plane to take out a handful of missiles is a poor exchange. But the main difference between the Osirik preemption and the preemption of chemical or missile sites is that Osirik had a finality. It put Iraq out of the nuclear missile business, the nuclear weapons business for a long time. A preemptive attack on missiles or chemical sites does not approach anything like that kind of benefit. So the fourth approach, and the most obvious of these approaches, the fourth one is defense, defenses. For chemicals, the chief defense that Israeli might adopt is heavy protective clothing. The gear is difficult to fight in. It slows your troops down, which is bad news for an Israeli force that is premised on speed and mobility. And it's also very, very tough if you have to fight Middle Eastern war in the summer. When it comes to defending against missiles, which could well have a chemical warhead, there is as yet no defense. But Israeli scientists have been working on an imaginative anti-missile missile called the Arrow. It would detect the incoming missile early in its flight, track its trajectory, and then intercept it, all in less than the 6 minutes flight time it has. The Congress of the United States has enthusiastically supported the Arrow program. We have authorized the Pentagon to fund 80% of the development costs. I've been a strong supporter of this effort. I hope all of this pays off. It's a nice symmetry. Modern technology counters the threat from modern technology. But let's not permit our enthusiasm to blind us. There are a few qualifications that should be considered. For one thing, the anti-missile technology hasn't been proven yet. Second, there is the cost. The costs of a full protective system for Israel are as yet unknown, but could easily top $10 billion. It's a lot of money. Some would say it's worth it as long as it guarantees that enemy missiles won't land on Israel. But is that true? Every billion spent to build Arrow is a billion that isn't spent on planes, tanks, and helicopters, training, and all the other components of a strong military. With Arrow, you gain a one-dimensional weapon system. It's great if the Arrows fire a missile at Israel. It's a Maginot Line if they don't. And $10 billion spent to build Arrow is $10 billion not spent on multi-dimensional weapons like planes and tanks and artillery that can defend against a whole broad spectrum of threats. We now have a demonstration program that is going on that involves Israel and the Arab. We in the United States do. It involves only 150 million so far, 120 million from the United States, 30 million from Israel. It is no doubt very well worth doing. It is money very well spent. And I want to see it continue to its completion. But once the demonstration program has been completed, we need to do some hard thinking and some hard calculating. One should not assume that if the arrow works, Israel ought to go ahead with full-scale production. So there we are, 4 items all on defense: denial, deterrence, preemption, defenses. What's left? The 5th approach is arms control. Now, arms control is something that the United States has done with the Soviet Union with some success. But arms control worked in this nuclear arena because neither superpower wanted a nuclear war, and both superpowers understood that the other didn't want a nuclear war. It also worked because arms control agreements provided Moscow with a certain cachet it sought, certain psyche. Signing arms control deals with Washington anointed Moscow as an equal, something that was important to the Soviet psyche. How does all this play out in the Middle East? Is it possible to imagine, in an era of all of this going on, that you might be able to do an arms control deal in the Middle East? Well, Ken Edelman, who I'm sure all of you know, is the former arms control director for President Reagan, recently suggested kind of an interesting idea. He proposed that Moscow and Washington open the INF Treaty to all countries. In other words, the signatories would agree, just as the 2 superpowers already have, to deny themselves missiles with ranges from 300 to 3,400 miles. The way it would be verified, and of course verification is the key issue in any arms control negotiation, the way it would be verified would be through a flight test ban. You cannot test the missile, which would be verifiable. You can tell if somebody's testing a missile. That you can tell. And if you can't test a missile, you soon lose confidence in it. It's a very interesting idea. It has some advantages. First, it would get rid of this problem and eliminate one threat to Israel, missiles, very important threat. Secondly, it is a reasonable request to make. The Third World has complained loudly about the superpowers' non-proliferation treaty involved in non-proliferation because Moscow and Washington are asking the smaller countries to deny themselves a weapon that the superpowers build to profusion. But in asking them to join on a ban on intermediate long-range missiles, we were asking the small countries to deny themselves a weapon the superpowers have already abandoned. The request, in other words, responds directly to Third World concerns. Third, and finally, in saying in favor of this proposal, is that such a missile ban could be verified by barring flight tests. That's a very, very important consideration for any arms control proposal. Well, it might work, and it might be something that we would want to try. And while there are several advantages to the Edelman proposal, I see some that are going to make it hard to make it happen. Let me mention a couple of things. Essentially, they revolve around the issue of negotiability. Is such an idea of banning chemicals or missiles or any of these weapons in an arms control regime with the Arab countries, is that really a negotiable proposition? Is that something that we should be heavily involved with and try to do it, even if you come up with a creative idea like Ken Edelman has here, a creative idea of how you might actually go about doing it if you were to embark on this possibility. The question is it really likely to pay off? Is there any chance that the Arabs could be seen, the Arab states could see it in their way to sign an arms control agreement of any kind with Israel? For one problem, one problem is that the Arabs would give up what they see as their equalizer. The Arabs believe Israel already has chemical weapons, atomic weapons, and better missiles. Most significantly, they recognize Israel's dominance over the conventional battlefield. They concede the inability of their forces to penetrate Israel. Missiles give them a reach heretofore denied them by the IDF. Therefore, is there any incentive for the Arabs to sign a missile ban. In a real sense, it's like Moscow trying to get the United States to agree on a ban on all nuclear weapons in Europe, while the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact have a predominance in the conventional balance. You're asking the other side to give up what they see as the equalizer. A second problem is that all the Arab states would have to agree, or none could agree. That's because the missiles aren't just aimed at Israel. The Iraqis developed missiles to hit Tehran. Those Saudi missiles can hit Israel, but it's not by coincidence that the Saudis paid for enough range to strike every major city in Iran and Iraq. Finally, we come up against the problem of the Arab psyche. It is the possession of missiles, the actual having them, and other modern weaponry that gives the Arab countries the cachet they seek. Arms control only threatens to deprive them of status. So finally we come to the sixth possibility of how do we deal with these threats, and that is the issue of peace. Is that a way to control the threat? Certainly, that's what Anwar Sadat decided well over a decade ago. He and other Egyptians sat down and made some simple, unemotional calculations. They calculated that what they wanted to do was to develop Egypt into a modern state. They calculated that the cost of continued confrontation with Israel, they added up the numbers, and they concluded they couldn't have both. They had to make a choice. They chose peace. It was chosen, to be sure, somewhat coldly, but they chose it rationally. What about the rest of the Arab world today? Is anybody going to follow Egypt's example? One can maybe argue that Jordan made such a calculation several years ago, but it's too small to speak out loudly. There is certainly no evidence that Syria accepts the Egyptian calculation. On the contrary, it's clear that Syria violently rejects the Egyptian calculation. And lots of the other Arab states, which are not bordered on Israel, fall somewhere in between. So as we look at the list of the threat of possible responses to the growing threat, denial, deterrence, preemption, defense, arms control, and peace, we see that they all suffer from some holes. There is no single clear and obvious way to deal with this no threat. Some combination of all of the above is probably what's called for. But we also see that the onslaught of technology means that Israel's ability to deny, deter, preempt, or defend is likely to erode. Not disappear, but certainly erode. That should elevate the significance of arms control and peace as a way to control the threat. What does this all mean for the peace option in the Middle East? It doesn't mean Israel should rush into any old peace agreement. It doesn't mean Israel must make peace in the next 18 months or else. Rushing contains its own inherent evil and induces you to make unnecessary concessions. It isn't for us as Americans to push Israel into making a peace agreement. Only Israel can make peace. A peace agreement won't mean anything unless it is supported by a majority of Israelis, or a majority of Palestinians, probably for that matter. But the United States does have a role to play in the peace process. I'm not talking about the meetings with the PLO in Tunis, or the convening of an international peace conference, or the oversight of elections on the West Bank. But it does mean that Israel should be applauded for the peace initiative it has just tabled. A little encouragement can go a long way. There is no need to drive Mr. Shamir to the right. There is such a thing as the U.S. being too cautious and too reactive. And as in the final analysis, there is something else which the United States can do to help Israel's security along with all of this. Besides helping it with military arms and military assistance to do all of the issues that are involved in trying to deny or defend against the new threats, there is something else something far more fundamental. Several years ago, the United States and Israel started down a new road, one intended to draw the two countries closer in practical working strategic relationship. Strategic means a network of political military ties. It is a development that hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves in the American media. Too few people are aware of just how the ties that bind Israel and the United States together are proliferating. Our societies have long been linked by bonds of friendship, shared values, and mutual respect. On the official level, however, the main ties were monetary aid provided by the United States to Israel and weapons purchases made by Israel from the United States. The official relationship really did not reflect the breadth and depth of the unofficial ties. The strategic relationship has been changing that and has been evolving over the years. It involves some simple and obvious ties, such things as visits to Israeli ports by the U.S. Navy ships so sailors can afford leave time in a friendly and fascinating country. It involves some practical military links, such links as joint training exercises by Israel and American military units. It involves the undramatic but very important aspect of mutual planning. All of these things get very little attention, in large measure because planning for future contingencies is highly classified. But it is a very, very important aspect of the evolving relationship. What's more, Israel supports the U.S. military like no other country in the world. And I speak of that with some experience as being on the Armed Services Committee and watching the attempt to get American military treated with respect abroad and the kind of feeling that we could get out of our allies abroad that our soldiers are there to help them. Very often you feel that we are there imposing on them. None of this do you get with Israel. Unlike in many allies, you don't hear Israel complaining about our visiting ships carrying nuclear weapons. Our sailors visiting there don't get shot at by passing motorists. The Israeli government isn't demanding a lot of military support from us while spending a fraction of what we put into defense. The Israeli government has not just been supportive of American policy and helpful to American interests, it has been extremely supportive and extremely helpful. Two years ago, I co-sponsored legislation subsequently enacted under which Israel is now officially recognized as a major non-NATO ally. Contrary to common understanding, Israel is an American ally in name as well as in practice. During a recent visit to Israel, I had the chance to see how the two-way relationship has been developing. Not just developing, but flourishing. It was impressive. Most significantly, I see nothing on the horizon to inhibit the relationship from growing even more extensively. A decade ago, I often noted a reluctance on the part of American military officers and diplomats to get closer to Israel. There was an attitude in the Pentagon and the State Department that Israel had nothing to offer. But the American officers and diplomats who have been part of this developing strategic relationship come home with a different attitude. As more American officers deal with Israel at the working level, more American officers are convinced that our relationship is a two-way street. I want to see even more American officials involved because each added increment of involvement is an added commitment to the ties that bind Israel and the United States closer at the official level. At its heart, the strategic relationship is meant to enhance Israel's strength. For all of the things that we were talking about in terms of the new threats plus of the old threats that have existed. But the way of dealing with the new threats through denial and deterrence, etc., it's meant to enhance Israel's ability to deal with the existing threats, the old threats, and the new threats. But it's meant to enhance Israel's strength, not simply the strength needed to deny others technology or to deter them from attacking, not simply the strength needed to preempt or defend, but the strength needed to make peace initiatives that will outlast and overcome new technological threats. The important thing we are doing in the defense arena today are useful in the sense that they buy us time. Restrictions on missile technology and transfers are helpful, but they leak. Clampdowns on the export of chemical precursors help too, but they also leak. We are able to slow developments, but we cannot turn back the clock. We can buy time, but time is not an inexhaustible supply. In the end, a true and comprehensive peace settlement is required. Only that, in the last analysis, can bury the menace. I opened with a quotation from John F. Kennedy. Let me close with another prescient observation of his. Quote, "We cannot afford to wait and see what happens while the tide of events sweep over us and beyond us. We must use time as a tool, not as a crutch." End quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Les Aspin. I have two important announcements. The lobbying appointments that you have been scheduled with for your senators and representatives are for tomorrow morning. Please remember, pick up your lobbying appointment card at the legislative desk before 4 p.m. today. If you do not pick up your card by that time, your appointment will be canceled. Your senators and representatives expect you because we made the appointments. It is important that you keep these. Buses leave 7:15 tomorrow morning from 24th Street. As for the banquet tickets for this evening, they will be available after 6 p.m. at the conference registration area. Please do not try to pick them up any earlier. They won't be available before that time. And now, if you we're a little late, if you'll proceed to the lobby workshops, thank you again.
We'll take a short break in just a moment to update you on our program schedule. But first, a reminder to our viewers to join us at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 8:30 Pacific, when we'll join in progress live coverage of a hearing held by the House Committee on Standards of Official Conduct. The committee will hear oral arguments on two motions to dismiss the current charges against House Speaker Jim Wright of Texas. The two motions were filed by Speaker Wright's attorneys. Join us beginning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time when we'll take you live to the House Ethics Committee hearing here on C-SPAN 2. Turning now to what's ahead on our program schedule, in just a few moments we'll bring you a speech by President Bush to a group of Cuban Americans commemorating Cuban Independence Day, which was Saturday. We'll follow that at 10:10 p.m. Eastern Time with remarks by Jack Kemp, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He speaks at a meeting of the National Home Builders Association. Coming up at 10:55 p.m. Eastern, join us for remarks by Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, who speaks at a seminar titled Violence Against Women, a Global Problem. After that, we'll air a forum on China in Transition, sponsored by the Ethics and Public Policy Center. That's a look at our program schedule. Thanks for watching C-SPAN 2.
C-SPAN 2 and its companion network, C-SPAN, are the cable industry's channels for public affairs programming. Since June of 1986, C-SPAN 2 has provided nationwide audiences with live coverage of the United States Senate and an inside look at the democratic process. If you have a question or comment about our networks, please write us at the C-SPAN Networks, 444 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite number 412, Washington, D.C. 20001.
Up next on C-SPAN 2, we bring you an address by President Bush to a group of Cuban Americans outside of the old Executive Office building. The President spoke in commemoration of Cuban Independence Day, which was Saturday, marking the 87th anniversary of that country's independence.
Good to see y'all. Please. What a great pleasure.